Wanted Bandit kidnapped a schoolteacher until she claimed she was his sister. Thomas Garrett had killed 7 men and robbed 12 banks. But nothing prepared him for the moment a schoolteacher looked into his eyes and whispered the name his own mother used to call him. The sun hung like a brass coin over Red Canyon, burning the breath from Thomas Garrett's lungs as his horse stumbled beneath him. Blood seeped through his shirt where the banker's final shot had found its mark, and behind him, somewhere in the maze of dust and stone, Sheriff Morrison's posse grew closer with each passing hour. The Dalton gang was scattered. Jake caught a bullet to the chest, Murphy's horse went down in the river crossing, and Billy might still be alive, but in this country might wasn't worth the sweat it took to think about it. Thomas pulled his hat low against the glare and squinted at the horizon. There, like a mirage shimmering in the heat, stood a lone schoolhouse. Whitewashed walls gleamed against the endless brown of the prairie, and beside it, a small corral held 2 horses that meant civilization, and more importantly, people with money enough to pay ransom for their lives. He dismounted slow, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with the weight of a man carrying too many dead behind him. Through the single window, he could see them, children bent over wooden desks, their voices carrying the sing-song rhythm of letters being learned. At the front of the room stood a woman in a blue dress, her dark hair pinned neat and proper, pointing to words chalked on a blackboard. The sight of those children, maybe 8 of them, no older than 10, should have given him pause. Should have reminded him of Sunday mornings long ago, when his own mother would read from the good book and speak of mercy. But Thomas Garrett had been hungry for 3 days, and desperate men don't have the luxury of conscience. He checked his Colt, counted 5 bullets, and pushed through the door. The children scattered like startled birds, their chairs scraping against the wooden floor as they pressed themselves against the far wall. Some whimpered. Others stared with eyes too wide for their small faces. But the woman, the schoolteacher, she stood her ground. "Children," she said, her voice steady as stone, "walk slowly to the door. Go straight home. Go tell your parents Miss Hayes will see you tomorrow." Miss Hayes. Thomas watched her face as the children filed past him, none of them older than he'd been when the world first showed him its teeth. She had brown eyes, the color of creek water in autumn, and hands that trembled only once before she clasped them tight in front of her. "What do you want?" she asked when the last child disappeared into the bright afternoon. Thomas stepped closer, his spurs jingling against the silence. "Money. Food. A horse that ain't half dead." He gestured with his gun toward the small desk where she'd been standing. "Sit down, Miss Hayes. We're going to wait right here until someone comes looking for you." She moved to the chair, but didn't sit. Instead, she studied his face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her eyes traveled from his weathered cheeks to the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Tucson. She looked at his hands, calloused and dirty, then back to his face. "Tommy." The word fell from her lips like a prayer. "Is that you, Tommy?" The name hit him harder than any bullet. Thomas Garrett, Black Tom to every wanted poster from here to California, hadn't been called Tommy in 20 years. Not since the night the world burned down around a farmhouse in Missouri and left 2 children orphaned under a sky full of ash. "Lady, you mistaken." But his voice cracked like a boy's, and the gun in his hand suddenly felt heavy as a millstone. She took a step closer, and he could smell the chalk dust on her dress, the lavender soap she'd used that morning. "You carved little horses from wood. Mama's horses, you called them. And when the storms came, you'd sing to me." Her voice broke. "You'd sing about the cowboy who rode the wind." Thomas felt the walls of the schoolhouse pressing in around him. Outside, the wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the empty prairie. His horse nickered and stamped, impatient to be moving again. But he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Ellie." The name escaped him before he could stop it. Tears ran down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust that had settled on her face. "I'll look for you, Tommy. Every town, every school I taught at. I kept hoping. I ain't Tommy." He raised the gun again, but his hand shook. "Tommy died in that fire with Mama and Papa." "No." She stepped closer still, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the face he'd seen in dreams for 20 years. Tommy became something else, but he's still there under all that hurt. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the canyon. Sheriff Morrison getting closer. Thomas looked at the woman who claimed to be his sister, this schoolteacher with gentle hands and a voice that remembered lullabies, and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed since he was 10 years old. The dust swirled around them, and in its silence, 20 years of separation hung like smoke between two people who had once shared the same cradle, the same nightmares, the same sky. In the growing shadows of the schoolhouse, two strangers who shared the same eyes stood facing the ghosts of what they'd been, and the uncertain promise of what they might still become. She knew the scar on his wrist came from the barbed wire behind their father's barn, and when she told him how he got it, the outlaw who'd forgotten how to cry finally remembered. The rope bit into Eleanor's wrists as Thomas's horse picked its way through the sagebrush, each step sending jolts of pain through her bound arms. But she didn't cry out. Not when the midday sun turned the air into liquid fire. Not when her throat grew raw with thirst. Not even when blood seeped through her blue dress where the saddle horn had torn the fabric. She cried because of the way Thomas held his shoulders, hunched forward like he was carrying invisible weight. The same way little Tommy used to sit at the kitchen table after Papa scolded him for tracking mud through the house. You remember Mrs. Henderson's apple pie? Eleanor's voice cracked through the dry air. She lived 3 farms over. Had that old rooster that chased you up the oak tree. Thomas's back stiffened, but he didn't turn around. Lady, I told you, I ain't the boy you're looking for. You carve your initials in that tree. TG, right next to mine. EG. She closed her eyes, feeling the memory wash over her like cool water. Eleanor Garrett. That was my name before I became Miss Hayes. The horse stumbled, and Thomas cursed under his breath. They'd been riding for 3 hours now, deeper into the canyon country where the walls rose like red towers against the sky. This was outlaw territory, places where lawmen feared to follow and decent folks knew better than to wander. Why'd you change it? The question came quiet, almost lost in the clip-clop of hooves on stone. Hayes was the family that took me in. Good people. They gave me schooling, sent me to teacher's college. Eleanor shifted in the saddle, tried to ease the ache in her bound hands. But I never forgot my real name. Never forgot yours either. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop beside a trickle of water that seeped from the canyon wall. He dismounted stiff and slow, his wounded side making him grimace. When he helped Eleanor down, his hands were gentler than she'd expected. The same hands that had once helped her climb trees and catch fireflies in mason jars. Drink, he said, kneeling beside the tiny spring. We got a ways to go yet. Eleanor knelt beside him, cupping the cold water to her lips. It tasted of stone and sky, nothing like the sweet well water from their childhood farm. But it was life, and she drank grateful. You still got that scar, she said, nodding toward his left wrist where a thin white line showed beneath his rolled sleeve. For when you tried to help Papa mend the fence. Must have been 7 years old. Thomas jerked his hand away like she'd burned him. Lots of men got scars. Not from falling into the Hendersons' barbed wire after chasing their pig back home. Eleanor's voice grew soft as evening shadows. Not from a little boy who cried harder about the pig getting loose than about the blood on his arm. For a long moment, the only sound was water dripping on his stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Thomas stared at his hands, at the scar she'd remembered, at the dust that covered everything out here like a second skin. I was 8, he said finally. Not 7. You remember. I remember a lot of things I wish I didn't. He stood up, his shadow falling across her like a dark promise. Remember the smell of smoke. Remember running through the cornfield with my nightshirt on fire. Remember folks saying our folks were dead and we was orphans now. Eleanor felt tears start again, but she blinked them back. The Mackenzie family took you. I remember that much. They had a farm near Jefferson City. They had work needed doing. Plowing, milking, mucking stalls. Thomas's voice turned hard as winter iron. Had a belt too when the work wasn't done right. And when I got old enough to fight back. He shrugged. Well, turned out I was good at fighting. Tommy, don't. The word came out sharp enough to cut. That boy died the same night Mama and Papa did. What's left is something else entirely. But Eleanor saw through the lie. Saw in the way he'd helped her drink. In the way he'd positioned himself between her and the wind. In the gentleness of his hands despite the roughness of his words. You sing, she said suddenly. I heard you humming while we rode. Same tune you used to sing to calm me during thunderstorms. Thomas went still as stone. The cowboy rides across the plain. Eleanor began singing, her voice thin but true in the desert air. His horse knows every star by name. When shadows fall and day is done, the cowboy's work is never done. Stop. But his voice broke on the word. You made that up. Said it was about a cowboy who collected lost things and brought them home. Thomas turned away, but not before she saw his face crumple like paper in a fire. When he spoke again, his words came out strangled, raw. I tried to find you. First year I ran away from the Mackenzies. I looked in every town between here and Missouri. Asked about a little girl with brown eyes and dark hair. But Eleanor Garrett, she just disappeared. I was Eleanor Hayes by then, and I was looking for Tommy Garrett, not some outlaw called Black Tom. The sun was sinking now, painting the canyon walls the color of dry blood. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Thomas lifted his head like he was listening to an old friend. We should move, he said. Morrison's got good tracking dogs. But as he helped Eleanor back onto his horse, she felt something shift between them, like a door that had been locked for 20 years was finally creaking open. The desert stretched endless before them, but for the first time since childhood, neither sibling traveled alone. Even if neither was ready to admit that the distance between them was shrinking with each shared memory that refused to stay buried. When Eleanor Hayes pressed her torn petticoat against her brother's bullet wound, she had to choose between the schoolteacher she'd become and the sister she'd never stopped being, and that choice would cost them both everything. The abandoned mining camp sat like a broken promise in the shadow of Devil's Rest, its weathered buildings leaning against each other like drunken men. Thomas guided his horse through the skeletal remains of what had once been hope, rusted machinery, rotting timber, and the black mouse of mine shafts that had swallowed men's dreams whole. "This'll do," he said, dismounting beside a structure that still had most of its roof. His face was pale beneath the dust and stubble, sweat beading despite the evening chill that was settling over the high desert. Eleanor slid from the horse, her legs trembling after hours in the saddle. The rope burns on her wrists had stopped bleeding, but her shoulders ached something fierce. Still, when she saw Thomas lean heavy against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his side where the banker's bullet had found its mark, she forgot her own discomfort. "You're bleeding again." "It's nothing." But the dark stains spreading across his shirt told a different story. Inside the old bunkhouse, shafts of dying sunlight slanted through gaps in the walls, illuminating a space that hadn't seen living souls in years. Thomas sank onto a rotting wooden crate, his breathing shallow and labored. "Let me see it." Eleanor knelt beside him, her hands reaching for the torn fabric. "Don't." He caught her wrist, but his grip was weak. "Don't need your help." "Tommy." The name came out soft as a prayer. "You're hurt. Let me help you." Something in her voice, maybe the echo of a little girl who used to bandage his scrapes with torn doll clothes, made him release her hand. Eleanor pulled his shirt aside, revealing the ugly wound that had been bleeding steadily since Red Canyon. The bullet had torn through the meat of his side, missing vital organs, but leaving a gash that needed tending. "I need cloth," she said, looking around the empty room. "Something clean." Without hesitation, she began tearing strips from her petticoat, the fine cotton that marked her as a respectable woman's sacrifice for the needs of an outlaw brother. Thomas watched her hands work, gentle, sure, the same hands that taught children their letters now learning to tend gunshot wounds. "Why?" he asked as she pressed the cloth to his side. "Why risk this? You got a good life. Respectable. Safe." Eleanor met his eyes in the fading light. "Because 20 years ago, when the fire took our parents and the world split us apart, I made myself a promise." She worked as she talked, wrapping the makeshift bandages around his torso. I promised I'd find you someday. I promised I'd bring my little brother home. I ain't that boy anymore, Ellie. The old nickname fell from his lips like something sacred. I'd done things, hurt people. The law wants me dead or in chains. I know what you've done. Her voice stayed steady, though her hands trembled slightly. I read about Black Tom Garrett in the newspapers. Every bank robbery, every gunfight. I knew it was you. And you're my brother? The words came out fierce as lightning. That don't change because of what you had to become to survive. A sound drifted across the canyon, the distant baying of hounds. Sheriff Morrison's dogs had picked up their trail. Thomas struggled to his feet, reaching for his gun belt, but Eleanor caught his arm. How long do we have? She asked. Hour. Maybe 2 if we're lucky. He checked his Colt, counting bullets that suddenly seemed precious as water in a drought. There's a cave about a mile up the ridge. If I can make it that far. Eleanor corrected. If we can make it. Thomas stared at her. This woman in a torn blue dress who'd chosen to bind his wounds instead of running for her freedom. Ellie, when they get here, you tell them I forced you to come. Tell them I threatened to kill you if you didn't. I won't lie. Then you'll hang beside me. Maybe. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her ruined skirt with hands that barely shook. But I won't abandon you again. Not when I just found you. The baying grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of vengeful spirits. Thomas limped to the window, peering through the gathering darkness toward the trail they'd followed. Torches flickered in the distance. Morrison and his men, maybe a dozen of them, riding hard through the desert night. They're coming fast, he said. Too fast. Eleanor joined him at the window, her shoulder touching his. Do you remember what Papa used to say about the storm cellar? Despite everything, Thomas almost smiled. Sometimes you gotta go down deep to weather what's coming. Maybe this is our storm cellar, Tommy. This place. This moment. She looked at him with eyes that held 20 years of hope and heartbreak. Maybe we were meant to find each other here, where everything's already broken, where we can't pretend to be anything other than what we are. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by men's voices calling out coordinates, directions, threats. Thomas positioned himself by the door, gun in hand, while Eleanor stood behind him, not cowering, but ready. Ready to face whatever came next as his sister, not his hostage. Ellie, he said, not turning around, if this goes bad, it won't. If it does, you remember what I was before all this. You remember the boy who carved horses and sang songs. Eleanor reached out and touched his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. That boy never left, Tommy. He's been waiting all this time for someone to call him home. Through the broken walls of the mining camp, the first torch appeared at the canyon mouth. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried clear across the desert air. Thomas Garrett, we got you surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and the woman don't have to get hurt. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had led him here. When he opened them again, Eleanor saw something she hadn't seen since they were children. Her brother, afraid but unbroken, ready to face the consequences of a life lived hard. In the gathering darkness of Devil's Rest, 2 siblings stood shoulder to shoulder against the approaching storm, bound not by rope or fear, but by blood and the terrible, beautiful weight of love that had survived 20 years of separation and sorrow. Eleanor Hayes walked into the crossfire with her hands raised and her voice steady, speaking words that would either save her brother's soul or see them both buried in the same unmarked grave. Dawn broke over Devil's Rest like a promise the desert wasn't sure it could keep. The sun painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, but Thomas Garrett felt only the cold weight of his Colt in his hand and the warmth of his sister's presence beside him in the abandoned bunkhouse. Sheriff Morrison's voice echoed off the stone walls, amplified by the desert's cruel acoustics. Last chance, Garrett. Send out Miss Hayes, and we'll make this quick. Thomas peered through a gap in the rotting boards. 24 men spread across the canyon floor, their rifles glinting in the morning light. Behind them, the hounds panted and strained at their leashes, eager to finish what they'd started. Morrison himself stood 50 yards away, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. "They got us pinned good," Thomas whispered to Eleanor. "No way out except through them." Eleanor smoothed her torn dress and checked the makeshift bandage around his torso. The bleeding had stopped, but his face was still pale beneath the dust and stubble. "Maybe there's another way. Ellie, there ain't no talking our way out of this. I'm wanted for murder, robbery. You're wanted for surviving." Eleanor moved toward the door, her chin raised in a gesture Thomas remembered from childhood. The same look she'd worn when defending him from bullies or Papa's angry words. "Sometimes surviving makes us do terrible things." "Where you going?" "To tell them the truth." Before Thomas could stop her, Eleanor Hayes walked out of the bunkhouse and into the morning light. The desert fell silent except for the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the nervous snorting of horses. "Sheriff Morrison." Her voice carried clear and strong across the canyon. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. I teach school in Red Canyon." Morrison stepped forward, his rifle lowered but ready. "Ma'am, we're here to get you safe. Just step away from the building, and I'm not his hostage." The words rang out like gunshots. "Thomas Garrett is my brother." A murmur rippled through the posse. Men shifted in their saddles, uncertain now. This wasn't the script they'd expected. "Ma'am, you've been through an ordeal. Sometimes folks get confused. I'm not confused." Eleanor took another step forward, placing herself directly between the posse and the bunkhouse where Thomas watched through the gap in the boards. 20 years ago, our parents died in a house fire in Missouri. Thomas and I were separated, sent to different families. I became a schoolteacher. He became an outlaw. But we're still brother and sister. Sheriff Morrison's face hardened. "Don't matter if you're kin or not, ma'am." The man's wanted for killing Deputy Barnes in Tucson. Inside the bunkhouse, Thomas closed his eyes. Eleanor didn't know about Barnes, didn't know about the deputy who'd tried to backshoot him outside a saloon, the young man with scared eyes who'd pulled his gun too slow and paid for it with his life. "I know what my brother has done," Eleanor continued, her voice never wavering. "I've read the wanted posters. I've seen the newspaper stories. But I also know what was done to him." She began to walk closer to Morrison, her hands open and empty. The rifles tracked her movement, but something in her bearing, the dignity of a woman who'd spent years teaching children right from wrong, made the men hesitate. "The McKenzie family took him in after our parents died. You know what they did to a grieving 8-year-old boy? Worked him like a mule. Beat him when he couldn't keep up with grown men's labor. And when he got old enough to fight back, they threw him out to starve or steal." Thomas could hear every word from inside the bunkhouse, could see the way his sister's shoulders squared as she spoke truths he'd never told another living soul. "Every man here had a choice," Eleanor said, now close enough that Morrison could see the tears on her cheeks. "You all had families who loved you, who taught you right from wrong in warm kitchens and safe beds. My brother learned to survive in barns and back alleys. He learned that the world would hurt him unless he hurt it first. Ma'am, that's real sad, but he carved wooden horses when he was 7 years old." Eleanor's voice broke, but she pushed forward. "He sang lullabies to me during thunderstorms. He once walked 5 miles to return a pig that had gotten loose from our neighbor's farm. That boy is still in there, Sheriff. Buried under 20 years of pain, but still there." Morrison lowered his rifle completely. Around the canyon, Thomas could see other men doing the same, their faces troubled by words that stripped away the comfortable distance between lawman and outlaw, between civilized and wild. "The law's the law, Miss Hayes. Then let the law show mercy for once." Eleanor turned back toward the bunkhouse, toward the brother she'd searched for across 2 decades of doubt and hope. "Tommy, come out here." "Ellie, no. Come out and let them see who you really are." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. Not the old wound from the banker's bullet, but something deeper. The shell he'd built around his heart since the night the world burned down was finally breaking apart. He stepped out of the bunkhouse, his gun hanging loose in his hand. The morning sun hit his face, and for the first time in 20 years, Thomas Garrett didn't flinch from its judgment. "My name is Thomas Michael Garrett," he said, his voice carrying across the canyon. I was born on a farm outside Jefferson City, Missouri. My parents died when I was 8 years old. And yes, I robbed banks and killed men and broke most every law you can name. He walked toward his sister, toward the line of rifles and the weight of consequence. But I never forgot the boy who carved horses and sang songs to keep the dark away. Sheriff Morrison studied Thomas's face for a long moment. "Drop the gun, son." Thomas looked at the Colt in his hand, the tool that had kept him alive for so long, the weight that had anchored him to a life of violence. Then he looked at Eleanor, at the hope shining in her brown eyes, and let the gun fall to the desert floor. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "if they hang me, they won't." She took his hand, her fingers threading through his like they had when they were children afraid of storms. "Because you're going to help them catch the men who are still out there hurting people. You're going to use what you know to make things right." Morrison stepped forward, his handcuffs gleaming in the morning light. But when he spoke, his voice held something Thomas hadn't heard from a lawman in 20 years: respect. "There's been enough killing in this desert," the sheriff said. "Maybe it's time to try something different." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Thomas's wrists, Eleanor kept hold of his other hand. The posse mounted up for the long ride back to civilization, but neither sibling looked back at Devil's Rest. They looked forward, toward a town where a schoolteacher walked beside her outlaw brother. Their shadows finally joined after 20 years of separate journeys through the wilderness of loss and redemption. The desert wind carried their footsteps toward an uncertain but no longer solitary future, proving that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is not running from home, but having the courage to build it again from the ashes of what was lost.